It already has been 15 years after the destruction of the Qing dynasty. In the aftermath of the 1911 revolution, China found itself in a non-stop downward spiral of civil war and breakdown of Chinese statehood. What started as a great journey of bringing China into the modern age by Sun Yat-sen has by 1936 devolved into a petty power struggle between the warlords throughout China upon which foreign powers continued to prey on. One of such nations was Japan. Ever since the Sino-Japanese War, the land of the rising sun continued to creep its way deeper and deeper into China proper. Japan's ambitions became blatantly obvious during the Mukden incident, during which the imperial army overran the region of Manchuria, restoring the Qing dynasty to the throne to serve as their own little puppet. At this time, China still found itself to be a highly corrupt and divided nation. Two men in particular sought to rectify this: Chiang-Kai from Nanjing and Mao Zedong in the mountainous north. Chiang may have had an impressive army on paper, but it too was plagued by corruption. The soldiers frequently found themselves without a rifle to train with, as their officers would rather sell the weapons and kits meant for the troops for the sake of enriching themselves. Reform was desperately needed. That much was obvious. The Chinese state, bureaucracy, and society needed to change if China was to be made a great nation like in ancient times. Chiang came around to the point of view that the root of all problems in China right now are deeply rooted in traditional Chinese society, which he could see was deeply corrupt. In attempts to introduce social reforms, he had little option but to make contacts with the remnants of the New Life movement. To enforce the intended social reforms, Chiang ordered the establishment of the NBIS. The caveat was that this task of establishing and running of this intelligence service was entrusted to Dai Li, who was closely affiliated with the fascist-inspired Blue Shirt Society. However, this was a risk Chiang was willing to take. Using his newly found powers and relative level of autonomy from the central government authorities, Dai Li went about implementing a police state which heavily punished having communist sympathies, while turning a blind eye to any crimes committed by the Blue Shirts. Effectively, China went into a period of a white terror. Spies were also sent to monitor Mao's movements, as well as providing the information to other warlords. In May of 1937, Long Yun had invited Chiang Kai-shek to negotiate future actions against the communists. Despite Chiang's determination to visit the province of Yunnan, some warned him that this could be a trap set up by Yun to bend the central government to his will. To everyone's surprise, Long Yun actually offered an alliance with the communists in order to unite all Chinese around the common enemy of Japan. However, considering recent developments in China proper, Chiang refused, even under the threat of being handed over to the communists and put to death. But luckily for him, no one was brave enough to do him harm. The arrests at the hands of a supposed allied warlord, being threatened to be killed by the communists no less, has made a great impression on Chiang. This has greatly shifted his view of Dai Li's recent actions, with his anti-communist and anti-federal beliefs becoming more radical. Some in the central government began accusing Dai Li of conspiring with Long Yun and the communists to try either beat Chiang into submission or to have him killed and then blame the communists for it. Suspiciously, anyone critical of Li's actions would soon disappear, with Chiang himself not commenting on the sudden disappearances. Some weeks later, reports came claiming increasing the numbers and activity of Manchurian and Japanese forces just across the border. During a military exercise, the Japanese officers claimed that the Chinese have captured one of their soldiers. Because of how untrue that was, the Chinese generals stationed in Beijing refused the request. In response, the Japanese opened fire. The Second Sino-Japanese War has begun. Within mere days of fighting, the Japanese have swiftly occupied Beijing. In the following weeks, the Japanese have made huge gains, pushing the Chinese back to the Yellow River. The biggest problem wasn't even the infantry, but the few tanks the Japanese have deployed. Without any means to destroy them, tanks simply rolled across the fields, pushing the Chinese even further back, with only artillery to rely on. By September, the Shandong Peninsula and the port of Qingdao were lost. Using scorched earth tactics and amassing more units from deeper within China, Japanese onslaught was finally halted, even if for a little while. Now it was vital to use the period of calm at the front to continue implementing the Big Rear plan. This plan went hand in hand with the lure them in strategy, which mandated that the deeper the invaders go into China, the more their logistics should be ruined and overstretched, giving the outnumbered and outgunned Chinese soldiers the advantage. It was especially important when considering that the NRA was still experiencing a serious deficit of small arms. The Japanese have tried many times to land in Shanghai and Ningbo, but with valor and clever maneuvering, those few Japanese divisions that did land on the mainland were consistently destroyed, further exhausting the Imperial Army. In February of 1938, Dai Li saw his opportunity to become the real center of power within the government. Chiang Kai-shek had a simple choice: concede serious power to Li or face a war-losing situation. For the sake of saving China, Chiang had to concede huge executive power to Li, effectively turning him into the de facto fascist dictator of China. However, Dai Li knew that it would be unwise and reflect poorly on him and his regime if he simply removed Chiang. Thus, he permitted Chiang to remain as the public face of the wartime government, while Li had all the actual power. Dreams of democracy were dead in China. Now there was nothing to prevent the fascist blue shirts from implementing their policies in the streets, as they were now protected from above by the Kuomintang. Now, as well as the communists, the blue shirts began attacking all foreigners they could get their hands on in China. In order to expose the flank of the Japanese army across the Yellow River, Dai Li orchestrated the takeover of the province of Shaanxi, assassinating the local warlord. The Japanese were taken by surprise, being forced to extend themselves even more. In February of 1939, Japanese had managed to break through the Chinese defenses, exposing the flanks of the Chinese army and threatening the logistics of units deployed on the right flank. A hasty retreat was ordered, with most of the Chinese retreating units surviving the ordeal. Seeing how the enemy is slowly approaching Shanghai and Nanjing, Dai Li intensified the propaganda campaign, proclaiming that this is now the final line of defense, which, if broken by the enemy, will be the end of China. This motivated the soldiers to fight harder. Despite the preparations, Chiang convinced Dai Li not to abandon Nanjing in favor of the spare capital of Chongqing. In June, the NRA abandoned Shaanxi too. In May, the NRA attempted a counterattack in a bid to encircle a sizable chunk of the Japanese, but the Manchurian troops have held the line, protecting the enemy contingent. By December of 1940, the Japanese were able to amass a large landing force, being able to beat the Chinese out of Shanghai, putting Nanjing under threat. However, the Chinese' desperate defense had stopped the enemy in their tracks. The Japanese army continued its offensive actions in the south, forcing the NRA to retreat to more favorable positions after another landing force landed in an undefended port. Brutal combat was still being waged over the Shanghai area, with territory constantly moving back and forth with neither side achieving any results. In June, the NRA managed to take back Jushuo, reaching around the enemy further south. Now that this supply hub was back under Chinese control, the NRA was able to finally achieve the goal of encircling the enemy south of the Yellow River. The Japanese attempted a counterattack across the entire front, but this failed. On October 1st, the supply hub at Jinan was liberated, making the situation for the Imperial Army even worse. Seeing their constant failures to conquer China, Japan kept going through prime ministers like a child goes through a box of sweets, Japan's political situation being stabilized only with the arrival of Hideki Tojo's iron grip. In an attempt to distract the public from failures in China, he pivoted the empire's attention to the Pacific theater, with Japan plunging itself into a war with all the Western powers, including the United States. By the merit of now sharing the same enemy, China became an allied power, working closely with Dai Li's spy agency to share information on the Japanese movements. This collaboration limited the enemy's gains to some Pacific islands and the Philippines. By October, the enemy-occupied Shandong Peninsula was isolated, leading to its liberation. With the aid of the Allies, China could now finally get on the path of climbing out of the small arms deficit it had to contend with throughout the entire war thus far. Now that the Yellow River was once again made the contact line of the two armies, the NRA prepared offensive operations along all sectors, commencing an all-out offensive in November of 1941. In January of 1942, the NRA liberated Beijing. There the soldiers found themselves fighting what seemed like a police force, consisting of local Chinese. As it turned out, the Japanese used collaborators to govern the land for them. The leader of the so-called Beijing regime was one Wang Jingwei, a former member of the left-wing faction of the Kuomintang. He was among those who were critical of the rise of Dai Li, now using the Japanese to what he thought was to liberate China from falling to fascism. He was not found in his Beijing office. Instead, heard broadcasting his propaganda over the radio from somewhere in the Manchu city of Xiqing. With the north secured, it was now time to liberate the southern areas. By April of 1942, all of China was cleansed of all enemy presence. Now it was time to bridge the gap between China and the allies fighting in Indochina, but for that the warlord of the Guangxi clique had to be taken out. This operation was extremely successful, with the NRA dashing deep into Vietnam and Laos. In November, an all-out offensive was ordered into Manchuria, with Manchuria eventually falling within a few months. By February of 1943, the enemy was swept out of the region, with the path straight into Korea now being open. In March, even the nationalistic Tojo government could see the writing on the wall for Japan's empire-building project in mainland China. Not wanting to continue a lost war, the Japanese offered very favorable peace terms for China. The Second Sino-Japanese War was over, with a firm Chinese victory. The whole country was in celebration while the NBIS and blue-shirt death squads patrolled the formerly Japanese-occupied territories, looking for communists and suspected collaborators. Korea was now an extension of China. Wang Jingwei was extradited to China, being sentenced to death for treason. Aisingiro Pui was now exiled for a second time in his life, now forever living in Tokyo under house arrest. But for Dai Li, this was just the beginning, as China was yet to be reunified. He It was now the time to eliminate the remaining stubborn warlords. In June of 1943, Dai Li was now standing at a balcony looking over a cheering crowd, with blue shirts dispersed amongst them. Chiang-Kai now proclaiming the reunification of the Chinese nation. A major war in Europe was still ongoing, with even Japan trying to fight against the Western powers. While the white man was still fighting his imperialist wars, shredding other white men to pieces, the great Chinese nation could now withdraw back into a time of peace, now free to rebuild and reclaim its former glory of old. Even though more than 50 million people have died because of Japan's war of aggression and brutal policies of oppression, Dai Li made sure their deaths were not in vain. Very few among the general public were aware that it was him all along who was pulling the strings of the Chinese state. But he knew he had secured his nation's place in the history books, as well as his own.